All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Dr. Al Carroll. Al is a historian, a professor of American Indian, Latin American history, and American history, and the author of several books. His latest is Presidents' Body Counts, the 12 Worst and 4 Best American Presidents based on how many lived or died because of their actions. You can find it at alcarroll.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Dr. Al Carroll. Al, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks.
All right, so Al, when you look at the title and when you look at the book, it actually seems really obvious that should be something that we do judge presidents on, life and death, how many people actually live and die because of their actions. But we really don't look at that very often. Begin by discussing what exactly prompted you to write this book.
Oh, I was really, there's been a whole series of rankings of presidents that's been going on for 50, 60 years by presidential historians, by commentators, by surveys of the general public, and they generally wind up being, they're ranking them on skill or what they see as accomplishments. But there's never been a moral component to this. There's never been a looking at how does this harm people or how does this help people. Very often, you'll see someone like Nixon ranked very highly for his skill, and undoubtedly he was a very skilled man, but that ignores the fact that quite a few people died because of his skill. You can point to, and I really hate to bring in the Nazi comparisons, but you can point to very skilled politicians in the Nazi regime who by those same standards would have been ranked highly. You have to look at what's the moral component again. You have to look at how many people lived or died, and you can actually point to presidents who played, for example, a direct role in genocide, Nixon being the example nobody points to. Very often when you mention Nixon, you immediately think of Watergate, but Watergate was a very minor thing compared to most of what he did. The worst thing he ever did was Cambodia. He invaded Cambodia, a neutral nation, unprovoked. He ordered a carpet bombing of Cambodia. He ordered that the country be bombed. The pilots were not even told that they were bombing Cambodia. They were given coordinates. And then those coordinates were changed halfway through the flight, and they were not aware they were bombing a separate country. And so he was able to keep that secret for over a year. And so he carpet bombed this neutral country, killing 500,000 people, and then ordered an invasion, killing 50,000 more, including a number of executions. So by any reasonable standard, you kill nearly 1 out of 10 people in the country, and that constitutes genocide. And then Nixon's actions also weakened the country enough that it turned the most Cambodians against the popular government, and they overthrew the government, and then the Khmer Rouge came to power, and they carried out a second genocide. So when your actions lead to huge numbers of people dying, just how much more incompetent can you be? So Nixon, I would argue, is the worst president of all time, and also one of the least competent.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it like with just the facts of life and death, it's pretty stunning. And the fact that, I know that there's some European countries that, I mean, Nixon's dead now, but for a long time, Kissinger's afraid of going to certain countries for being, potentially being tried for war crimes, and they should. You could look at many U.S. presidents that should be tried for war crimes. But again, it's just that so many died under Nixon. And again, when you look at the actual body counts, Nixon is by far the highest. So how many, begin by telling us kind of how do these stats come up, because it's kind of hard to actually figure out, talk about your methodology, I guess, because there's direct responsible deaths via bombing, via the military, but then you also, for Nixon, you talked about what happened in Cambodia after the U.S. did all of their stuff, the post-consequences. Kind of talk about the methodology of how you came across these figures and came up with these figures.
The very worst of the worst presidents had a direct role in genocide. So you have two presidents, Nixon and Jackson, who both ordered genocide, Jackson ordering the Trail of Tears against the 5 Indian tribes, and then Reagan, who had a direct role he collaborated with genocide. He did not initiate it, but he collaborated with it, gave it funding, gave it training, gave it military advisors. Reagan in Central America, where he took part and collaborated with the deaths of 200,000 Mayan Indians in Guatemala, and also sponsored state terrorism in Nicaragua, and also sponsored repression and bombed El Salvador. Then you have presidents who turned a blind eye to genocide. Franklin Roosevelt, who ignored the Holocaust. He had plentiful information that the Holocaust was going on. He could have made efforts to stop it. He took the advice of generals. to do nothing when he could have very easily bombed the rail lines, taking Jews and others to the death camps. Potentially, he could have saved 1 out of every 10 victims of the Holocaust. Nixon, again, one example why he's one of the worst of all presidents. He ignored the genocide that was going on in Bangladesh, up to 3 million Bengalis that were killed. And not only that, he intervened to prevent India from intervening in the genocide. Clinton ignored the genocide going on in Rwanda. You had several American presidents who ignored genocide against California Indians. Very few people know that California was founded upon genocide. You have Ford, who ignored the genocide going on in East Timor by the government of Indonesia, and Jefferson ignoring genocide that happened in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. You have some presidents, in the next tier, you have presidents who played a role in atrocities during wartime. So McKinley, there were atrocities going on when the U.S. conquered the Philippines. Franklin Roosevelt and Truman targeted German and Japanese civilians. Truman dropped the A-bomb. President Polk provoking a war against Mexico and then ignoring the atrocities that happened there. And our current President Obama, his program of a drone assassination. And then the next year you have death because of incompetence or simple blindness based on ideology. So you have deregulation, which kills quite a few people. You have people who are dying from preventable deaths. You have Truman's hardline anti-communism, which probably started the Cold War. Johnson and Nixon keeping the Vietnam War going when anybody reasonable could have seen that the war could not be won. Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan, again ignoring the failure of both wars. You have James Buchanan's incompetence that led to the Civil War, made the Civil War much worse than it should have been. The Civil War potentially could have been over in months if not for his incompetence. The war on drugs, killing many people. Madison and the War of 1812, blundering into a war which was so incompetently run, the White House was burned down, and Washington, D.C. itself was occupied. You have G.W. Bush's handling of Katrina. And then the next tier, you have other wars of aggression. You have biological and chemical warfare. And then you have ignoring terrorism. American presidents like Andrew Johnson ignored terrorism during Reconstruction by groups like the KKK. Cuban-American terrorists, ever since Kennedy, have very often been ignored, and in one case was actually pardoned. Bush Sr. pardoned a terrorist by the name of Orlando Bosch, who bombed a Cuban airliner and killing over 70 people. You have right-wing terrorism, which has committed many more acts of terrorism than Al-Qaeda or its affiliates, which has been going on all the way into the president. You had know-nothings who committed anti-Catholic terrorism that was ignored by the president. And you have local repression. You have a program of torture, for example. Both Johnson and Nixon carried out a program of torture in the Phoenix program, which killed many more people than G.W. Bush's torture program. You have internment by Franklin Roosevelt. You have repression in American colonies, like in Hawaii. And that was the lowest level of tier. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson in World War I, you're talking about somewhere in the dozens of deaths compared to Nixon in Cambodia, where you're talking over 500,000 deaths.